Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Move On Up, Chicago Soul Music and Black Cultural Power by Aaron Cohen, narrated by J.D. Jackson. Introduction. The sounds of Chicago soul have always felt as expansive as a drive through this city's neighborhoods and down its wide boulevards. Vocal groups harmonizing about yearning for or losing eternal love defined the early 1960s, and singer-songwriters with acoustic guitars and a broader lyrical vision closed the decade. Some records' muscular brass sections propelled dancers. Slower ballads highlighted intricate string arrangements. Even the blunt word funk signified and combined everything from small African percussion to interstellar explorations. R&B star Jerry Butler took in large pieces of it all. When he used his music to become an agent for wider changes, he did so in the city that always surrounded him. Almost 60 years after Butler and his early group, The Impressions, signed their first recording contract on Michigan Avenue's Record Row, his career outside singing was just as significant as his hits. He organized a songwriters workshop that created a repertoire for artists who followed him. Then, after largely stepping away from the concert stages and studios in the 1970s, he went on to become a successful entrepreneur and politician. Butler was elected to the Cook County Board of Commissioners in 1986 and served there for 3 decades, so he could have been justifiably proud when we talked on an Independence Day afternoon in 2016 as he neared retirement from public office. But hubris has never been his style. Instead, Butler's conversational voice merely hinted at his on-stage baritone. Quick-witted asides poked at a more serious tone. He also credited much of his accomplishment to his community. I'm always prejudiced when I talk about Chicago, because I think it's such a great city, Butler said. Most of what's done in this city is prompted by politics, and most of black politics is supported by music. And so the music and politics kind of walk hand in hand down Michigan Avenue. Move On Up, Chicago Soul Music and Black Cultural Power details these meetings of music and hope for social progress. Mass movements and localized efforts for dynamic change helped create R&B in Chicago. Here, too, musicians acted as change agents. Still, compared with other cities, surprisingly little literature describes how musical and social forces combined in this metropolitan area during the 1960s and 1970s. As a teenager, I read Sweet Soul Music, Peter Guralnick's 1986 intermingling of Southern R&B and the Civil Rights Movement, and wondered how such reporting would describe the urban North's culture and its struggles. But since the late 1990s, considerable work has focused on developments in soul music from such hubs as Memphis and Detroit. Suzanne E. Smith's Dancing in the Street, Motown and the Cultural Politics of Detroit, and Charles L. Hughes's Country Soul, Making Music and Making Race in the American South are examples from 2 historians. Chicago has not been as fully investigated as these Southern and Midwestern counterparts, despite its large size, voluminous output, and intense political exchanges. That comparative lack of attention has been true even for local institutions. While I was growing up in Evanston, just north of Chicago, local artists' contributions were never part of my school's curricula in the 1970s and 1980s, although a terrific soul singer, Patty Drew, lived just a few blocks from my classrooms. These musicians had numerous traditions to draw from, such as gospel and blues, yet they had the confidence to declare their musical independence, recasting time-honored music to make it their own. A sense of autonomy also fortified the songs that came out of these neighborhoods, through the heroic black educators, record companies, and performance spaces that African-American Chicagoans owned and managed. The results helped shape canonical black American music through recordings that convey a full stylistic range. Musicians also intersected with Chicago activists, whether political or commercial. All of this occurred as African-American media in the city evolved with advances in radio, television, film, and other industries. Black advertising firms in the city enlisted R&B studio players to promote a heritage along with marketing household products. The politics that Butler referred to include, yet are not limited to, elections and other forms of civic governance. His friend, Curtis Mayfield, wrote lyrics that came loaded with a polemical discourse and lend this book its title. But actions are as important as words. Musicians learning to become entrepreneurs or banding with like-minded collaborators can be as consequential as inspirational verses. Big changes can be sparked just from trying to work or even dance across neighborhood boundaries. Move On Up focuses on the period from the time Butler's group first recorded in the late 1950s until he entered another kind of public service in the early 1980s. These 25 years in Chicago proved vital. A generation born at the tail end of the African-American Great Migration created its art while contending with segregation, integration, and deindustrialization. Music ran alongside civil rights activism, and some performers contributed to that crusade. Like their contemporaries in the civil rights movement, these musicians displayed ample courage to cope with daunting oppositional force, even when just getting together to perform or compose. In that way, their artistry resembled the work of activists, as they also took it upon themselves to make things better even in the worst of times. The contributions of the city's musicians to such national currents as the late 1960s counterculture and black arts movement also created enduring artworks that deserve more attention, as do the stories behind their conception. As these campaigns turned toward commerce and achieving elective office during the 1970s and 1980s, musicians remained linked with these tides. Black music in Chicago continued to evolve during the later 1980s and throughout the 1990s and 2000s, but I chose not to cover those years here because those eras deserve separate books. Although I discussed the beginning of the house scene and its ties to a previous generation of music makers, a comprehensive study of that genre requires a deep dive into its changing aesthetics and narratives, such as internationally celebrated DJs, rapid technological advances, LGBTQ performance spaces, and municipal licensing laws. Presenting the recent development of hip-hop and drill music in Chicago would involve analyzing the controversial lyrics as well as detailing at length celebrated personages and recent changes within the public schools. I mention a few current musicians in the final chapter because of the way they speak about enduring soul culture and demonstrate it through their work. That a couple of them are just starting their careers provides hope for the future. My methodology stemmed from my work as a journalist, which meant speaking with as many participants as I could. So I included interviews with a range of people who made it all happen. My concentration is on artists, but entrepreneurs, fans, media figures, activists, and one original Soul Train dancer also provided valuable observations. A few became famous early in their careers, and many others were connected with people who emerged much later. At the same time, I wanted to focus on the Chicago area rather than attempt overly broad comparisons or contrasts with other cities. Some of these interviews stemmed from my contributions to magazines and newspapers. Along with enabling access, these assignments spurred my determination to undertake this larger endeavor. Each encounter reaffirmed my conviction that the music and the circumstances surrounding it told a bigger story than could be presented through a series of articles. I cannot say for sure if I had this project in mind when I visited Terry Callier in 1997, but I do know that he caused many people he met to think deeply. Some speakers contradict each other, while others voice confirmations. All quotations in Move On Up are from author-conducted conversations, unless otherwise noted. Popular and academic media brought up additional insights, which sometimes ran counter to, and at other times agreed with, the book's primary witnesses. These include newspaper archives, such as the Chicago Defender and Chicago Tribune, as well as national magazines with a focus on African American topics, Ebony and Sepia, and a host of music journals. Musicologists, historians, sociologists, and political scientists occasionally corroborated these testimonies and reports, and sometimes they argued against them. My idea was to balance journalistic approaches with academic techniques and discourses to tell a story that should have more than one dimension. I used a similarly inclusive method in my previous book, which looked at the creation of Aretha Franklin's Amazing Grace album and discussed its influence. Recent cultural histories of Chicago also helped guide my framework. Chief among them has been George Lewis's 2008 study of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, A Power Stronger Than Itself. While I could never claim any kind of insider status, such as Lewis has achieved within the AACM, his presentation of the voices of participants, along with his assessment of the media and scholarship, is a paradigm. Discussing popular R&B artists requires different prose style and terminology than does writing about experimental jazz musicians, but in Chicago, the two genres actually cohered, a point Lewis highlights. I also model my approach on the work of historian Sheldon Cohen, whose writings about colonial-era Americans who are worthy, albeit lesser known, shine a brighter light on that time than the standard great man view of national progress. He is also my dad. This demonstrates another reason for focusing on the voices represented in this book. All the artists made often stellar albums and singles that deserve wider attention in homes and on dance floors. Mostly, the chapters are arranged chronologically, but like a classic 1960s R&B dance groove, the narrative calls for some stepping backward and sideways in time. I'll leave it to listeners to decide if I share Jerry Butler's geographic prejudice about our city's status. My intention is for Move On Up to jumpstart conversation. 1. Hallways and airwaves. Changing neighborhoods and emerging media inspire new music. Sometime in early 1958, 5 singers and their manager navigated a stretch of Chicago's South Michigan Avenue known as Record Row. Confident, persistent, and with nothing to lose, they hoped that one of the equally undaunted companies lining the street would change their fortunes. Had they traveled the entire mile and a half of the street, they would have ambled from Roosevelt Road on the north to East 25th Street on the south. Collectively known as the Impressions, these vocalists in their late teens and early 20s were from the Cabrini Green public housing project on the north side. Curtis Mayfield was not yet 16. Decades later, he recalled snow up to their necks that Saturday morning, but it proved little hindrance as he carried his guitar and amplifier down the street. Eddie Thomas, the group's manager, came from the South Side. He was about 10 years older, and his education in the music business combined street smarts with improvisation. They recalled that their first stop was a company called King, but its roster was full. Then they called on Chess Records. Same response. Next, they approached a record company named VJ on the other side of the street. We went over there, and I introduced myself to Calvin Carter, who was the A&R director at the time, Thomas recalled. I told him I'd like to bring my group over. So we set up a date to bring them in, and we went back over to VJ Records. A cold winter night, too. Snow on the ground. And we did a couple songs, and he said, "Man, your group is sounding good." And I said to Curtis, "Go and do For Your Precious Love." We did one take. Where's the contract? Okay, they signed us up. As Jerry Butler remembered it, their interests were to be heard and not to be cheated. Almost 50 years later, he recalled, "We just wanted to see if someone would listen to our songs without a hidden tape recorder going in the drawer." This sequence of events and its aftermath, a hit song, international fame for the group, and solo careers for Butler and Mayfield, plays out like the kind of life-defining moment confirmed through collective memories. Legends do tend to conflict with other published narratives, but several singers, instrumentalists, and producers who grew up in Chicago at that time experienced similar moments. Some of these artists and producers worked on or near Record Row. Others worked throughout the city. Many of them lived through the circumstances that led to the recording of such songs as The Impressions' For Your Precious Love. Major social shifts ran underneath that tune's 4 chords, Mayfield's lyrical guitar lead, and the group's incantatory harmonies. Those harmonies convey understated power. No big vocal leaps or instrumental flourishes were needed to make For Your Precious Love, a departure from the doo-wop that came before it. While only a few people were on hand for the recording, a community generated the circumstances for this song to be created, and for a larger audience to hear it. Not only had the Great Migration from the South dramatically boosted the black population of this Midwestern city, but the Impressions generation forged an identity through music. Diverse circumstances strengthened Chicago area teen culture during the 1950s and 1960s. Songs frequently arose within the hallways of public housing projects or schools, places full of teens with plenty of ideas and varying religious denominations informed young singers' vocal training and inflections. The process of recording For Your Precious Love also reflected bigger changes. This single was cut for an African-American-owned company, VJ, that was a landmark operation but not the only one of its kind. Emerging radio personalities provided airtime for records like these and spoke the same dialect as their listeners. These media voices would promote new economic resources and political advances as eagerly as they broadcast R&B hits. The real financial beneficiaries of these developments would always be questioned. These were commercial enterprises, not social missions. But whether or not everyone acted in harmony, and even if a burgeoning movement did not yet have a name, this record announced a push forward. On the eve of the civil rights movement in the 1950s, many Chicagoans had a great deal to push against. Schools in African American communities faced overcrowding and other entrenched difficulties. Barriers to equal employment were visible throughout the city. Butler remembers walking downtown and seeing signs that barred blacks from applying even for dishwashing jobs. His memoir describes the racism he encountered as a student at Washburn Technical High School, a vocational institution near Cabrini Green. He knew that the program could take him only so far, since white-dominated unions ran apprentice programs specifically to keep blacks out of skilled trades. Butler, like other black musicians from his generation, remained steadfast. Black musicians who came of age in Chicago from the 1950s through the 1970s usually were either part of or not far removed from the mass movement of hundreds of thousands of African Americans who left the South for the Midwest's largest city. As journalist Isabel Wilkerson noted in The Warmth of Other Suns, the Illinois Central Railroad carried so many Southern blacks north that Chicago would go from 1.8% black at the start of the 20th century to 1/3 black by the time the flow of people finally began to slow in 1970. By the 1950s, moreover, these new Chicagoans would arrive with higher levels of education than earlier waves of migrants, and thus greater employment potential than both the blacks they left behind and the blacks they joined. They also tended to have more education than the city's white immigrant arrivals. Parents sought to pass this advantage on to their offspring, although they faced institutional barriers within a school system that was 90% segregated by 1957, and remained so 60 years later when the city's public school students were 47% Latino, 37% African American, and 10% white. As the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, reported, in cost and quality of instruction, school time, districting, and choice of sites, the Chicago Board of Education maintains in practice what amounts to a racially discriminatory policy. The fight against discrimination became as internal as it was organizational. Leon Forrest, who grew up on the South Side in the 1940s and 1950s, argued that his family and neighbors took on structural disadvantages through survival strategies and mutual support systems. In his essay collection, Relocations of the Spirit, he wrote, "More than anything else, we believed that the individual had to find something within himself, some talent, moxie, intelligence, magical nerve, swiftly developed skill, education, knack, trade, or underground craft, and energize it with the hustler's drive. Indeed, these are qualities that most musicians have needed, but black artists in Chicago who developed these attributes could also rely on some reinforcement." While Forrest illustrates how such performers had to build such qualities from within, some institutional support also existed for the kind of education he mentioned, and many times that came down to committed faculty. Families of young musicians in Chicago sought out the high schools in African American neighborhoods that had solid music programs and teachers who were more than adept. Saxophonist Willie Henderson and trombonist Willie Woods still credit the discipline they learned from band teacher Lewis Whitworth at Wendell Phillips High School in Bronzeville. Captain Walter Diet, who taught at Wendell Phillips and DuSable High Schools from 1935 into the 1960s, became one of the most admired teachers. A graduate of Vandercook College of Music with a master's degree from Chicago Musical College, Diet's students included Nat King Cole, saxophonists Johnny Griffin and Von Freeman, also an arranger at VJ, and many other jazz heroes. Diet also taught future R&B musicians like violinist-turned-guitarist Bo Diddley and Morris Jennings, later a Chess Records session drummer. Many of these artists have commented on their teacher's musical expertise, tough methods, and warm heart. His professional background and a supportive community embodied the qualities that later scholars of education would describe as essential. Another drummer, Marshall Thompson, who would switch to singing, added that Diet's pedagogy might seem unorthodox to some. "Captain Walter Diet started me off," Thompson said. "He was one of the greatest musicians in the world. He'd throw that stick at you if you played the wrong note. He'd throw that stick right at your face. It was amazing. We had a 30-piece orchestra, and he could tell who was playing wrong." Budding musicians also honed their skills through higher education. Between 1941 and 1964, the proportion of blacks who completed college rose from less than 2% to greater than 5%. As part of this trend, in 1950 Chicago, more college and postgraduate educational opportunities became available to African Americans. Roosevelt University was founded in 1945 as faculty left the city's YMCA college to protest that institution's quotas on black and Jewish students. By September 1954, Roosevelt could boast a fall enrollment of 3,500 students in its schools of arts, sciences, commerce, and music. This was part of a local wave of 90,000 college students, including 11,600 in the city's 3 junior colleges. Alabama-born James Mack was one such student. His classical music education included bachelor's and master's degrees from Roosevelt in the 1950s. During the next decade, he would mentor a host of future R&B stars at Crane Junior College before becoming in demand as an arranger. Another arranger, Charles Stepney, attended Wilson Junior College in Roosevelt. In the late 1960s, he would apply experimental compositional theories to R&B, blues, and rock. Religious foundations reflect multiple sources. Migrants and their children also heard or participated in older traditions, from blues to singing in the many churches on the west and south sides. Curtis Mayfield and Jerry Butler had abundant experience with church music. Mayfield also expressed his admiration for blues musicians. Mayfield was born in Chicago in 1942, and a few months later Butler, at age 3, arrived from Mississippi with his mother and father. As teens, both performed in Mayfield's grandmother's traveling soul spiritualist church. But while soul music is rooted in gospel, a common depiction of the black church as a single entity is misleading. The influence of sanctified and Baptist shouts and rhythms on gospel and R&B has been described frequently, including in my previous book. But denominations in black Chicago represented a cosmopolitan mixture, as did the music that resulted from this diversity. These churches and their different reflecting class, theology, and missions had expanded since the beginning of the Great Migration. Eugene Dixon, who would become known as Gene Chandler, sang in a Baptist choir. Marshall Thompson said that the Shielites used Catholic liturgical singing as their model. The Flamingos, who formed on the South Side in 1952, belonged to the Church of God and Saints of Christ, which incorporated Jewish theological and musical influences in its services, and the group retained these minor key refrains in its R&B ballads. Maybe these cries also reverberate in the eerily beautiful a cappella opening of the group's Golden Teardrops. Dell singer Chuck Barksdale imitated the bass voices he heard in his church, but he also insisted that his group's vibrant harmonies derived from a denominational cross-pollination. "I was raised Methodist. I became a Muslim," Barksdale said. "Mickey McGill was a Seventh-day Adventist. Marvin Jr. was a Jehovah's Witness, and Johnny Carter was Hebrew. So we had 5 different situations going on, but we never had an argument about our religions. Everything that God puts together is going to be right. Mathematics is exact." Other musical influences from churches were not so straightforward. In North suburban Evanston, Patty Drew grew up singing in Mount Carmel Baptist and Bethel African Methodist Episcopal congregations. In the 1960s, her jazz-inflected delivery shone on such hits as "Tell Him" and "Working on a Groovy Thing." Drew claimed that since her style did not come unadulterated from a purely Baptist or sanctified gospel tradition of ecstatic spirituality, her work was not easy to market as hard soul. She said her approach also derived from the very plain, very straight style of her main childhood church, but she also said she admired jazz stylist Nancy Wilson. Religious roots involved more than just singing or transforming the rhythms and phrasings of a traditional repertoire. Churches back then and today provided either a rudimentary musical education or a gateway to alternative music schooling. This offered a rich reservoir from which African American youths could claim more music as their own. As a child, Barbara Ackland sang in the New Zion Baptist Church Choir and studied classical music there too, although she later mentioned preferring soulful pop. Singer-songwriter Laurel Simon's experience in church furthered his education. His hearing another performer in the church prompted him to ask his grandmother, a housekeeper, to pay for voice lessons. Neighborhood bonds and collisions. Even as young people, some migrants brought Southern traditions with them, which became enhanced with...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?